Okay, then I give a warm welcome to all of you today. Today we have another internal speaker at the Diginomics lunchtime seminar, namely Milan Klus. Milan just recently joined the University of Bremen and is now a postdoctoral fellow, and will also help me to manage the Diginomics group. And so if you have any questions or suggestions, or just want to talk about the strategic future of the group, or whatever you want to discuss about it, you're more than welcome either to talk to Milan or to me. And he will probably always have an open ear, be it via Zoom or in person, probably also his coffee. If you visit his office, I know he has a coffee machine. Milan actually did his PhD just recently at the University of Münster, where he wrote a cumulative dissertation about success factors, business alliances, and leadership skills in the digital age. And he will also talk about this today, namely in the context of fintechs, by his presentation, Starting New by Fitting In, FinTech Startups Endorsements by Analysts. And so the floor is yours, Milan, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Lars, for the introduction and for the opportunity to talk about an ongoing research project by Carsten Sørensen from the London School of Economics, Neil Pollock from the University of Edinburgh Business School, and me. As you just said, it's entitled Starting New by Fitting In, FinTech Startup Endorsements by Analysts. So let's start with the motivation for the project. What we've observed in recent years is an unprecedented growth in the creation of digital startups, many of which will not be able to grow and survive. And one reason for these unprecedented growth and the emergence of digital startups is that digital technologies offer unbounded possibilities for the combination or recombination of existing software libraries into new solutions. And this results in lightweight technologies such as apps, which have lowered the barriers for engaging in digital innovation. And what this means in turn is that significant technological developments now come to prominence quickly and outside of the large vendor labs. From a startup point of view, this means that for a startup, it's critical to make sure that the target groups, so for example, potential investors, customers, partners, are able to understand what new capabilities a venture is actually able to offer. And in terms of March's 1991 characterization of organizational learning as the dual exploitation of the new and the exploitation of the old, this can be seen or described as a situation in which new digital ventures try to explore digital newness while seeking this newness into existing context of existing or established organizations. And according to Holmberg and Mathiansen, they can basically choose between two survival patterns. One being the exploitation survival pattern or the improvement survival pattern, where you try to look at existing solutions and make them incrementally better, or the exploration survival pattern, the innovation survival pattern, where you actually try to do something disruptive, something really new, and enter the green field. And then there is a growing body of literature on ambidexterity, which actually says you have to do both if you want to survive. But whatever survival pattern a startup chooses to follow, it faces a high uncertainty of technology adopters. So what technology adopters need to do, they need to secure against being early adopters making wrong decisions or buying digital innovation from a venture that will not be around in a few years. And an additional factor here is that established technology adopters oftentimes buy software products relatively rarely and have this limited experience in assessing the performance and viability of vendor organizations and knowledge of the rapidly changing market of offering. And what they oftentimes do to deal with this situation is they seek help from specialists in the process of assessing and choosing between ventures. And this problem led to the emergence of new market actors who actually track the emergence and development of new ventures. And what we are referring here to is the nearly 1,000 industry analyst firms of varying size and importance who research the strengths and weaknesses of different ventures. And of course, you have to say that industry analyst firms have been around for a while, but Neil Pollock, one of the co-authors who actually studies analyst firms since over 10 years, argues that this group has only recently began to focus on digital startups. And it seems to be the case that winning coverage from industry analysts has become an important staging point for new ventures, or an evaluative hurdle, because these analysts seem to guide technology adopters about which ventures to include in procurement shortlists. So what they do is they channel attention towards some specific providers and away from others. And what analysts do is actually they write research reports, for example, they do presentations, they advise clients, but they also have powerful tools like, for example, the Gartner's Magic Quadrant or the Forrester Wave, where they first of all categorize services. That's a very important aspect of their work. And then rank different providers, vendors within these categories. And these are highly visible and highly accepted on the market. So these are quite powerful tools. And what they also have is, at least some of them, awards. And here is an example. So Gartner has the Cool Vendor designation, with which they award young ventures that they see as being particularly impactful, innovative, and intriguing. But when trying to identify a gap in the literature, one has to consider and keep in mind that much has been done in this area. So for example, there has much been written about the liability of newness of new firms. This is a notion that Stinchcombe introduced, I think, back in 1965. And what they can do to reduce information asymmetries to, for example, potential investors to attract funding, but also, of course, customers and partners. And the theoretical foundation for those uncertainty reducing activities lies especially in agency theory and signaling theory. And interestingly, there are some indicators that overcoming the liability of newness relies more heavily on external legitimacy than it does on internal measures. So that's what we know, and this is actually not very new. But as far as we know, until today, little is known about how intermediaries as industry analysts influence the growth and scaling of fledgling digital ventures. And this is where we try to contribute. So this paper addresses the role of industry analyst endorsements in the growth and scaling of new digital ventures. And we decided to focus on the financial services industry, so fintechs in particular, where we argue it is particularly difficult for newcomers to gain a foothold due to all these regulatory hurdles and numerous established organizations. And you can find some evidence in the literature, like the financial services sector is characterized by tightly regulated institutions, such as banks who oversee the complex digital infrastructures. And we thought that for fintechs, this means that they are in particular critical need to explain how they fit by translating their innovative offerings into this well understood and traditional established context. To be a bit more specific, our aim is to throw light on the role of industry analyst endorsements and how they help fintech startups enter and fit in to a domain dominated by these traditional and conservative players. And to do so, we investigate two hypotheses and one research question. The first hypothesis being receiving an award from a major industry analyst firm has a positive effect on the funding of young digital ventures. And the second one being the value of analyst endorsements goes beyond the market signal and lies particularly in a less visible exchange of information between the analyst and both the endorsed venture and its potential customers, investors, and partners. So the first hypothesis is one layer, the visible part. So for example, we have these designations like the Cool Vendor Award, and this signals to the market that venture is being covered by an industry analyst firm. And we think that has a positive effect. And we also argue that this is not all what's going on, but that there is much happening behind the scenes. And we try to investigate with this with our second hypothesis. And then we wanted to know how digital ventures would rate the importance of different forms of endorsement. So we formulated this research question of which forms of endorsement are perceived as central by young digital ventures to build up credibility and scale. And to investigate these hypotheses and the research question, we used a combination of a quantitative and a qualitative analysis to understand actually what effect analyst endorsements have on the development of fintech startups. And for the quantitative part, we used propensity score matching to empirically show whether coverage given by industry analysts affect the funding of fintech ventures, which relate to hypothesis one. And to this end, we focused on fintechs which were awarded cool vendors by the analyst firm Gartner. So in advance, we looked at all kinds of industry analyst firms, and only some of them have awards. And only some of these award-giving firms focus or consider fintech startups. And Gartner considers by far the most fintechs and is overall one of the biggest analyst firms worldwide. So we thought it makes sense to focus on this particular firm to have a comparable sample. And in addition to that, we carried out semi-structured interviews to obtain explorative insights into the potential value of analyst endorsements for these firms and learn more about the relevance of different endorsements. Regarding the propensity score matching, we used an approach suggested by Rosenbaum and Rubin, which actually says you're going to match on observable dimensions. And in this study, this has been the age of a fintech, the number of employees, the country of headquarters. But of course, you have to take into account that there was already a pre-selection with the focus on the fintech domain. And we decided to use nearest neighbor propensity score matching, one-on-one matching, without replacement. And what this means is you have a cool vendor award winner, and then you want to find the nearest neighbor. So a company that is as comparable as possible based on these observable dimensions, except from the variable of interest, which is the funding in our case. And without replacement means that one nearest neighbor can only be the nearest neighbor of one firm and not of several firms. And in line with some research articles, for example, the Fond et al., we decided to set the maximum distance of the propensity scores for these neighbors, the caliper, to 0.03, which is quite common. And as a data source, we mainly used Crunchbase, and I will say a bit more about that in a minute. Regarding the semi-structured interviews, which were necessary to investigate hypothesis 2 and research question 1, we conducted interviews with CEOs and or founders and marketing managers of fintechs that have received this cool vendor designation. And we used an interview guideline to get comparable results. And the interviews were conducted digitally via Skype or Zoom, audio recorded and transcribed. And the coding was done according to the Gioia method and using the software MaxQDA. I assume you're all familiar with the Gioia method, which is actually a data compression process where you compare similar statements and compress them into overarching themes, which then can be compressed, if possible, into overarching dimensions. So what we had to do first is we had to identify cool vendor fintechs, right? And we had to do it in a reliable and standardized way, and that wasn't easy. What we did was we looked at all Gartner categories for each year since 2004, and this is the year when the first cool vendor designation was given to a company. We had to do that manually, check that manually, and then included these firms into the Crunchbase database. Why is that? So, as I said before, analyst firms categorize services, and so does Gartner. But the problem was that Gartner has not a specific fintech category. So fintechs can be found across all different kinds of categories. And this caused some trouble because some of these categories were quite clearly linked to the financial services sector, for example, AI and banking. But other categories were pretty broad and not directly linked to the financial services industry, like identification or similar things. So we had to find a database that tells us more about the core business of ventures. And Crunchbase is quite useful here because it not only contains finance-related information, but also categorizes the core business of ventures. And we carefully reviewed all categories included in Crunchbase and then made a selection, namely asset management, banking, finance, financial services, fintech, mobile payments, and payments. So, okay, we looked at the Cool Vendor Award winners across all categories since 2004, entered all of them into the Crunchbase database, and whenever a venture fits into one of these categories, we decided to include it in our sample. And we have decided to also add the category blockchain, as blockchain technology is closely related to the financial services industry and represents a fast-growing sector. And this resulted in 107 Gartner Cool vendors related to the predefined categories, 18 of which were providers of blockchain solutions. And I can say here that we later excluded these 18 blockchain providers from the sample to check the robustness of our results. And the picture doesn't change very much when excluding these firms. So they seem not to be systematically different from the other fintechs. And then, of course, we needed a control group for the propensity score matching. What we did was we entered the same search terms into the Crunchbase database and ended up with 6,769 fintechs. However, data on all variables of interest, namely the funding, age, country of headquarters, and number of employees, was only available for 3,530 firms of the control group and 88 cool vendor fintechs. So this was our final sample, 88 cool vendor fintechs, for which we tried to find the nearest neighbor within the group of 3,530 firms. And here is a visualization of the matching process, which actually shows that the matching process went quite well. On the left-hand side, we see that there were significant differences between the control group and the Cool Vendor Award winners based on the observable dimensions, employees, age, and country of headquarters. So the solid line marks the Cool Vendor Award winners and the dashed line marks the control group. And after matching these two groups, the significant differences disappeared, which is actually what we wanted to achieve. But the more interesting thing is whether cool vendors are better funded than companies without such an award. And the T statistics of the propensity score matching indicate that cool vendor ventures have significantly more funding than those without this designation. And this result can be seen both in comparison with the whole sample as well as with the matched sample, which supports our hypothesis H1. And to be able to interpret this table, I have to say that we measured the total funding amount as the natural logarithm of total funding, as this variable had a skewed distribution. But now, of course, you could argue and think, have these ventures really received further funding because of the award? Or was it the other way around, that these firms got on the analyst's radar because they were particularly well funded? Could be both ways. So what we did is we tried to figure out a bit more about that and looked which of these 88 cool vendor fintechs received additional funding after getting the cool vendor designation. Turned out that 41 of them received additional funding. And when excluding these 41 firms from the sample and applying the propensity score matching again, we no longer find any significant differences between the funding of the firms with and without this designation, which indicates that being financially well equipped didn't necessarily lead to receiving the cool vendor designation. Rather, it seems to be the case that, or at least in many cases, that after award financing sums make up a large part or share of the total funding amount. And this is visualized here. So on the left-hand side, we see the total funding amount of fintechs without the cool vendor designation. And on the right-hand side, we see the total funding amount of fintechs with this designation, and the circles represent the total funding amount and the crosses the sums that have been invested after receiving the award. And what we can see is that the crosses are almost identical to the circles, and this indicates that indeed large sums have been invested after the award was given to a venture. But okay, now you could say, well, you must consider that ventures receiving the cool vendor designation in earlier years were more likely to receive additional funding compared to startups which received the cool vendor designation in later years. And to check for that, we limited our sample to the award year 2018. And what we find is that the picture doesn't change much. So we have some evidence, at least, for our first hypothesis. And as a robustness check, we ran regressions, and they basically indicate the same results. Let's look at the interviews. So for the interviews, we contacted executives of the identified cool vendor fintechs via LinkedIn, and 21 of them agreed to be interviewed. And we have executives from India, Germany, USA, the Netherlands, Israel, Austria, UK, Canada, Switzerland, and so on and so forth. And on the right-hand side of the table, you can see the Gartner categories and within which they were awarded. And this fits to what I've said earlier. Some of them are clearly related to the financial services sector. For example, cool vendors in AI for FinTech in Asia Pacific, or cool vendors in banking. But some seem quite unspecific on first glance, like cool vendors in integration or cool vendors in Asia Pacific. So that's why we had to use Crunchbase to learn more about what the respective venture actually does. And in total, we were able to encode 1,283 text passages, which we then tried to compress into overarching themes and, if possible, superordinate dimensions. And we started with the survival patterns, picking up on the idea by Mathiansen and Holmberg. And interestingly, as suggested by ambidexterity literature, most of the interviewed executives would describe their survival pattern as a mixture between the exploration of existing solutions and of new solutions and the exploitation of existing solutions. But some would also assign themselves more to the exploration pattern or the exploitation pattern. And here are two examples. The first being for the exploitation pattern. One interviewee said, "So the reason we exist is largely because the financial institutions are extremely challenged by upcoming digital platforms, new additional banks, or our financial technology companies, which are looking to expand. And what we do is enabling the incumbents and industry to be more digitally connected with their customers." And then there was an interesting quote related to the exploration pattern. And the interviewee said, "If you feel like a startup entrepreneur in a green field, it's nice. But if you feel like you don't have any competitors and there is nothing done in that direction anywhere else, then you should look very closely, because that's a big danger that you'll just be in nowhere. Nowhere is also a green field." So it somehow seems to be quite problematic, especially in the fintech domain, to be on this exploration pattern. But we will learn more about that in a minute. So, and then we were able to identify further themes, one being normal signals are not sufficient anymore in a more and more digitalized competitive environment. And here is a quote saying, "So for attracting talent and attracting investors, the normal signals don't really matter as much. I mean, you have to have a nice looking website and be able to communicate well. But like I said, the barriers to doing this stuff is super low, and it doesn't legitimize you in any sort of way." And this relates directly to our motivation slide, which I showed at the beginning, where we argue that if more and more digital ventures are able to enter the market and send signals and create noise, the normal signals don't work don't work so well anymore, because they don't legitimize you. You have somebody who says somebody who's already established in the target field, who says you're good. And we also find some evidence for our claim that the financial industry is special. And here is a quote: "It is an industry that has been the same for a very long time. In their processes, they're really stuck in their ways. So yeah, just validating a technology that is so new can be a challenge in this market." Another theme is based on many quotes, the balance between the old and the new. So this relates directly to the challenge of doing something new while also being able to fit this into an existing context. And here's a quite good quote: "What we find is that we may want to disrupt, and we think the disruption is great. That's the sort of mindset of the entrepreneur. But what we find on the ground is that people don't want to change much. If it's too hard, they don't pick it up. So we've moved into a pattern of exploitation as survival, which is incrementally making things better." So this is kind of an overall view on the situation and the market. We now dive a bit deeper into the role of analyst endorsements. And within this category, we've been able to identify several topics. The first one is particularly related not only to analysts and analyst relations, but to the cool vendor designation in particular. So many interviewees see this cool vendor designation and industry awards as a buy signal. And one interviewee said, "I'm convinced that it's a strong signal and it's really helpful for pitches at new customers. When you say cool vendor, people pick up their eyes, whether it's your supplier or whether it's your customer or whether it's investors. It definitely carries weight with it." Some also describe the cool vendor designation as a quality stamp. here is an example, and it's a quality stamp. You know, if these guys say you're good, then you're good. That's how it works a lot in our world, especially in the banking world, where people tend to are risk averse. So the second aspect of the quote is also related to why it is particularly interesting to look at the financial services industry, because here it seems to be indeed particularly difficult for a new startup to enter the market. And then we found some evidence for our second hypothesis, where we claim that it is not only about this quality stamp or the signal, the award itself, but that there is also happening a lot behind the scenes that is less visible or not visible at all. And one example is that analysts have been described as tour guides. So I remember this interview. It was an entrepreneur who was providing blockchain technology, but not in the financial services industry, or not for making money transfer safe, but to make IoT safe. So technology devices and the exchange of information between technology devices. So he's trying to fit this existing solution into a new context. And he said, we are traveling in fields where we are not at home, as if one would travel to a foreign country and say, I would like to do something there now. And then there is a tour guide, if you like, who says, that's the providers, that's the rules, and so on. So he said, if you build up analyst relations, it's kind of a two-directional conversation process where you educate the analysts about your ideas and what you do, and the analyst educates you about your target market and about how the whole situation looks like and what you should do and shouldn't do. And in the context of what's happening behind the scenes, we also found several quotes describing analysts as market influencers. And here is a good example. There is the public endorsement, but there is also what is happening behind the scenes. So the analysts are Gartner and Forrester, especially Gartner, are working directly with end users to help them with vendor selection. But they are actually involved in behind the scenes in pretty much every enterprise field that we're in. We don't hear directly about it, right? It's all confidential between them and their customers, but they know the tailors and we know. And some even say that it's actually not really about the award, but that they have kind of concerned the market in terms of people that pay for consulting services and industry research. So these are, of course, only a few examples of our broad body of data. There are so many aspects in it, but these are some examples to shine a light on what different aspects emerged from the data. And one additional thing is we asked the interview participants to talk a bit about how they perceive the relevance of different forms of endorsement. And then we compared the statements and figured out that by far the most frequently mentioned aspect is customer endorsements, interestingly followed by established advocates. So this seems to support our argument that in a more and more digitalized competitive environment, it is not only the entrepreneur who decides how digital innovation is shaped and developed, but it's becoming more and more a complex interplay between the entrepreneur, the market, and powerful intermediaries such as analysts. Other aspects related to important endorsements include partnerships, journalists, press, investor endorsements. So it's not only the financial endorsement, but many spoke about investors who are in your board and are really interested in making your business successful. Then some people said it's good to have a famous or established individual in the team. Some also spoke about startup programs, influencers, bloggers, and advisory from industry experts. And we found interesting that not many people spoke about influencers and bloggers, which are a particular large group in the digital age. So when comparing established advocates and influencers, bloggers, or also press, you have to make a differentiation. And we looked into the literature for that aspect and found that there is much written about celebrity endorsements. But in this case, it seems that a celebrity endorsement only becomes valuable if there is a high congruency between the endorser and the endorsed firm. And so if a product is complex, you would want to have an advocate who is an expert in the field. So expert endorsements seem to be much more relevant in this field in the fintech domain compared to endorsements by journalists, press, or influencers, bloggers. And my last topic for today relates to the notion of an endorsement, because you might wonder what the differentiation between a signal and an endorsement actually is. And when you look at the literature, you find not that much about the notion of an endorsement, but for example, Zimmerman and Seitz defined an endorsement as a favorable opinion given by one organization to another, which actually serves as a vote of confidence in the endorsed organization. And the idea is that the legitimacy of an expert endorser spills over to the endorsed venture, which he or she vouches for, which is particularly important for young firms that are not yet established in the market. And so it's not the pure sending of a signal from one party, but it's more a complex interaction between someone who tries to enter the market, a new venture, and advocates. And to make this a bit more clear, we tried to develop a conceptual framework differentiating these two terms. And on the left-hand side, we can see some typical characteristics of a signal, which is embedded in the definition of a signal. So a signal is observable, a signal is costly to obtain and imitate. Sending a signal is a conscious effort, it's a voluntary effort, and accordingly, it's within the control of the signaler. And when looking at typical characteristics of an endorsement, it's not necessarily observable. It's also costly to obtain and imitate. So there is an intersection between a signal and an endorsement. You cannot completely separate them. It results from interactions. It's a favorable opinion, and very critical aspect is it involves a third party. And this means that it's not fully within the control of the endorsed venture. And we placed all the different endorsements we were able to identify in our study in the intersection between the signal and an endorsement, because we argue that you need a context-specific view on this. And I think I have to make an example, or give an example. So when looking at analyst endorsements, when they don't give an award, but only advise clients behind the scenes, or advise you, your young venture, about what to do and about how to enter the market, then it looks more like an endorsement. But once an analyst starts to speak publicly about a venture, or gives an award to a venture, then you could argue that it is actually some form of signal and not a typical endorsement anymore. So you see what I mean? You have to look at the specific context and then decide whether something that happens looks more like an endorsement, or whether it looks more like a signal, or whether it has elements of both sides. And typical signals would be things like the firm age, firm size, patents, and these kind of things. So I think I spoke roughly 40 minutes, and I think I will leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.